any country, no matter how powerful, has a challenge dealing with a nuclear armed state. And
Do you really think war is likely?
it is, soon to be the third largest economy. It is the world's most populous country. It has it has one of the largest standing militaries in the world. Could India do it all on its own at this point in time? I think that would be very difficult.
Does India possess the ability to redefine the international order? We have with us Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the executive director of Observer Research Foundation America chapter. And over the last decade, Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar has emerged as a prominent voice on Vishwashastra. To our audience, it's a detailed account of the evolution of Indian foreign policy and statecraft. The book is divided into two sections, primarily history and strategy. And basically, in this book, Dhruva essentially elaborates on India's interactions with the world, its cosmopolitan identity, and a powerful geopolitical discourse India has carved out in the past 2 millennia. So we will begin our discussion with a few questions with Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast, and thank you so much for coming to discuss about your book with Man Gan. My first question on your book is, when you talk about strategic culture, what does it mean when you say that India possesses a strategic culture, and how do you establish this continuous stream of thought between ancient Indian statecraft and present day thinking on Indian foreign policy?
Mhm. So what I tried to do with a lot of the history, particularly the pre-independent history, but also after, was try to simply describe what India's interactions with the world were. And try and keep it less about my opinion or my interpretation, although I do have some interpretive aspects at the end, beginning and end. But the largely, I wanted readers to draw their own conclusions, and I tried to document in some ways how were Indian leaders in the past thinking about India's place in the world, and how are they making decisions about interactions with other political entities, later other states. Um, and I think, I mean, I would hope that what readers get away is that Indian leaders, past and present, for all the rhetoric, if you strip aside the rhetorical aspects of what they are saying, are making decisions based on a sort of pragmatic approach to the world, and are giving sometimes deep thought to these international interactions. So some people like to describe it in the form of a strategic culture. There's a rich body of literature on strategic culture generally, and some of it applied to India as well. I, I don't necessarily go down that path of trying to interpret that in that way. But I do think that there is this thread that goes back many years, and in some cases, I go back to writings from about 2,200 plus years ago, about how Indian leaders are thinking about the world. I mean, really from Ashoka onwards, we have pretty good documentary evidence of that. But again, we have in the oral tradition, even a longer tradition going back more than 2,200 years. I would also a bit hesitate to say that there's always been one continuous tradition. I think it's much very layered. I try and document sort of different layers. You had in North India, South India, again, different traditions, different parts, West and East as well. Northeast has its own traditions. And then again, with different periods, the medieval period added other layers to it. The colonial period added other layers to it. And of course, post-independence as well. So in some ways, there was a sort of intersection of ideas that came about. So it was not always one continuous thread, although you can find points of continuity throughout. I mean, I would say the one good example of that, which others have written about, I only devote, I think, one sentence to this, is that things like the Ramayana and Mahabharata are things that are in the popular domain. People know about it. People know the stories associated with it, and a lot of the stories, particularly the Mahabharata, but even the Ramayana, have deal with questions of statecraft and international relations.
Thank you so much. Then it takes me to the second question, that what is Greater India? Because Greater India finds itself in many writings by our nationalists, our cultural revivalists. What do you have to say about Greater India, and does it figure in the Indian foreign policy?
So, I mean, I only use it in the historical context. In Calcutta in the early 20th century, there was something called the Greater India Society, and I think you can probably trace it. There's an article by Kalidas Nag in 1926, I believe, which kind of started this movement, pre-independence, of course, of rediscovering Greater India. And perhaps the most famous proponent of this was R.C. Majumdar, who's a famous historian. And what they were finding at that time, and through archaeological and epigraphical inscriptions, documentary evidence, and others, was that there were these connects between Indian culture, particularly, and Southeast Asia, especially, going all the way to Vietnam, Cambodia, Vietnam, what is today Indonesia, up to the Philippines and China in some cases. But I suppose the same could also be applied to Central Asia as well. Again, there's Afghanistan and Central Asia, and up to Tibet and Xinjiang as well. And in all of these areas, there was this quite a distinct imprint of Indian culture. In some cases, religion, language, translation, often via translation. I think that idea, whether you want to call it Greater India or not, this idea that there was this larger Indian cultural, linguistic, commercial footprint over a much larger area than many Indians even imagine is certainly there. And again, I try and document a lot of that. What were actually those interactions like? So you had, for example, imprint of Indian architecture in Central Asia. You have traders going all the way to Russia on the one hand, indirectly all the way to Morocco and Europe, and through indirect intermediaries, with Egypt up to what is today Egypt, and then east also up to South China Sea, southern China. So you have this Indian print. However, I would caution this did not always mean that there was a political or military political cohesiveness, or that this was often took a sort of military or imperial kind of nature dimension to these interactions. There are a few exceptions to it. For example, many people know the Chola naval expedition to what is today Indonesia. That is documented. Also, at times, Central Asia as well was governed from what is today India. But for the most part, this was not of some military or political nature. And so this idea that this was a kind of a grand imperial project or something, which is how sometimes I find it portrayed, that is not borne out by any kind of real documentary evidence. At best, so in some cases, these were very sporadic military interactions that did take place.
Now we come to the present day issues that India confronts and India addresses. And the first issue I could think of is the crisis in the international institutions and their inability to address conflict or even generate consensus. Can India fill this vacuum? Because there is a lot of optimism in your book, and you have categorically mentioned that these are certain things where India is leading the way. Does India possess the ability to redefine the international order?
I think the short answer I would give is not on its own. I mean, I think if you look at, I mean, I like to describe the evolving international order in very material terms because it's simple in some ways to think of it that way. You have a world where the US remains a very prominent power, but where its old this sort of alliance structure that it developed, the US and its allies together constituted more than 80% of the economy in the early 1990s. And while the US share is held relatively firm, about 20 to 25% of the global economy, it's essentially its old alliance networks involving Europe, Japan, Korea, others, has started to shrink in share. And instead, we've seen China to a large degree, to a lesser extent, Russia, but China certainly fill a lot of that void. So in terms of a share, it's now almost a peer competitor of the US. So we're seeing a world where this old institutional structures that the US helped create and US and its supporters helped create is eroding. And it's sometimes from the inside. There's a great deal of skepticism from Donald Trump, the US president, from many leaders in Europe even, about continuing with this. At the same time, it is facing a challenge from China and others who want to overturn many aspects of that order. And for a country like India, and India is not alone in this, the idea is how do you preserve the gains of, in many ways, India benefited from many aspects of that order, but ensure that countries like India have a greater say in that, in governing that. And so that I think is the central challenge today for the international order from an Indian perspective. I think the good news is India is not alone in believing this. And so I think what we will have to see is how India can work with the countries that want changes, in many cases, China, Russia, and others, but also work with the status quo powers to preserve some of those gains to help fashion a new international order. And look, I think India doesn't, obviously is not in the same league at present as the US or China. I hope it can be in the next, few decades. I think that should be the desire of any Indian. But that being said, it is, soon to be the third largest economy. It is the world's most populous country. It has it has one of the largest standing militaries in the world. It has a fair amount of resources to help shape that order. But I think the short answer is, could India do it all on its own at this point of time? I think that would be very difficult, which is why building global coalitions is very important. And where I conclude is sort of India is really a reformist power in the international system. It wants changes, but it wants those changes to be, to the extent possible, gradual, to preserve some of those changes rather than a revisionist order that completely changes everything. Which, by the way, the risk of a completely revisionist order that some are advocating for is that actually Indian equities will actually be sidelined in that as well. So I think that is broadly where I come out.
Okay. And we move on to the elephant in the room, which is China, given our interactions and relationship. You discussed China in depth, and you also mentioned that there's a growing resource allocation in China, in India on China studies. It's a very personal question because it's also tied to the broader academic community and the policy academic interaction in India. In your opinion, how deeply do the Indian policymakers and thinkers understand China? Because there has been a literature on Nehru's understanding of China and that of his successors. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think China looms large. In fact, I think in my book, China is mentioned more than any other country apart from India. So it does loom quite large. And I do make the case that I think we need a better understanding of China. I reflect a lot on past mistakes as well made in terms of engagement with China. I think a few things. One, I think it has improved. The understanding that China is important has really risen in the Indian government and in the Indian policy community more writ large. Also, frankly, I think the last 20 years, opportunities have increased to interact with China. So you see, for example, in the Indian Foreign Service now, much larger, China remains the most sought after language to study if, for many people in the IFS. The army has a cadre of now China specialists as well. There is a dedicated think tank in the government called CCCS, Center for Contemporary China Studies. It's the only dedicated country-specific entity like that brings people from all of the government to look long-term at the challenges and opportunities posed by China. You have a growing number of students who are studying Chinese, and sometimes not just in mainland China, but also in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and elsewhere. The intelligence agencies are more focused on that. Even if you look at the resource allocation for the armed services, it is more China focused today than it was in the past. So all of that suggests that that shift is taking place. One could argue it is still not enough, and much more needs to be done. But the point is, and this is not just a challenge that India is struggling with or Indians are struggling with, but globally, we have a situation where essentially the understanding of China policy, particularly, is becoming much more difficult because access is breaking down. Archives that were once, 10, 15 years ago were open in China have closed. Even, the ability to conduct interviews with policymakers is much more constrained than it was in the past. And so it's becoming harder even for people who've devoted a lifetime, not Indians, and who have much better, theoretically much better access and resources. Even they are struggling now to understand changes in decision making in China as well. But the good news is I think that shift has taken place in India, but a lot more needs to be done to develop particularly a much more granular understanding.
My last question is on Pakistan. Considering what we are going through at present, um, as we go through your book, Indo-Pak relations are again explained in great detail, and this brings us to the question that despite our assertive posturing and diplomatic pressure, which has actually increased since Prime Minister Modi assumed power. New Delhi still finds it challenging to come out of this cyclical trap where a terror attack is followed by a kinetic action, but then the cycle repeats again. Just your thoughts on, do you really think war is likely, in your understanding of the broader landscape, since your interactions span across multiple countries and you see that interface between India, Pakistan, US, China? And in your thoughts, what are the available options in the Indian strategic playbook to deter terrorism?
Yeah, so I mean, I go into the origins of how Pakistan developed this policy and the infrastructure for terrorism, and using non-state proxy warfare. It goes back to 1947, and it took on another dimension, particularly after the late 1980s with the flaring up of the insurgency in J&K. And then the other dimension was the nuclear dimension, right? So essentially, since the mid-1980s, Pakistan had a latent nuclear capability, which they tested publicly in 1998 along with India. So, look, the reality I think is that any country, no matter how powerful, has a challenge dealing with a nuclear armed state and coercing and in India's case, compelling a nuclear armed state to do something. I mean, the US and Israel are finding that with Iran, which has not even gone nuclear yet. They've found it difficult with North Korea, which has gone nuclear. So I think the bar is therefore quite high for how to deal with a nuclear armed state. And particularly, I go into some of the culture of the Pakistan army and how it views India, and it views that there's a sort of ideological conflict with India rather than a material conflict with India, which is more problematic. But the long and short of it is, what I say is, like, it's a long-term game. Pakistan is a problem to be managed, not to be resolved immediately. It is India needs to use positive and negative levers. And the good news is it has partly worked, right? Which is that the instances of terrorism have come down in both severity and regularity. Particularly, I think there was a moment after 2008, which after 26/11. And then again, after about 2013 or so, there was another wave of attacks between 2011, 2010, and 2013. But since then, there's been a drop. And now every major attack, for 2 years, I think Prime Minister Modi made a concerted effort at trying to engage with Pakistan from 2014 to 2016. In each case, his efforts were undermined by Pakistan. But since 2016, I think there's been a change in policy, a change in approach, and India has decided to respond. And the challenge, I think, is how do you respond in a manner that is sends the message that is retributive, that sends the message that this is unacceptable on Pakistan's side. And this time is particularly bad because it's a killing of civilians that are the target. In the past, the focus had been on military and paramilitary forces, primarily, sometimes police stations. But this is very much a civilian target. So I think that message will have to be sent, and therefore some kind of kinetic action is probably to be expected. In addition to diplomatic measures such as the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, which has been announced. We will see what happens, but this will have to be done in a way that also prevents escalation. So I think, I would imagine some kind of more targeted and more proportional kinetic action is possibly on the cards, just going by what happened the last two times, which is after the Uri attack and after the Pulwama attack. So I think this is the reality of what we're dealing with. It will continue to happen, but as I said, I think this is a challenge to be managed rather than resolved for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much for your answers, and thank you so much for your time. And we would strongly encourage our viewers to go through Dhruva's new book, Vishwashastra. And the book is especially dedicated to the youth of India. And it makes a terrific read on basically the evolution of the Indian statecraft over the last 2 millennia. Thank you so much, Dhruva, and we will be back with the new podcast again. Our host,